Good evening and welcome to the 45th Ashley Fellow Lecture at Trent University. I'm Dr. Christine Freeman Roth, Head of Colleges at Trent and Principal of Lady Eaton College. And I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that we're on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. And may we offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and their teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings today and every day. I'm a settler here and grateful to make my home in Peterborough, Nagojawinong. In my personal and professional life, I'm committed to continued learning from Indigenous peoples, sharing what I've learned, recognizing past injustices, and working towards reconciliation. As I said, this is the 45th year of the Ashley Fellowship, and this is administered by the colleges at Trent University and awarded to a visiting scholar every year. And this creates a wonderful opportunity for the university and the wider community to benefit from the presence of a distinguished intellectual who enhances our academic programs and our collegiate life. The fellowship is funded from a bequest from the late Professor C.A. Ashley, a longtime friend of Trent University, and an enthusiastic proponent of the importance of collegiate life in the academic pursuits of the university. The Ashley Fellow then is a visiting scholar who is a resident guest in one of Trent's residential colleges. And we're very happy to have Subhankar with LEC this year. And by the terms approved by Senate in 1976, and in keeping with Professor Ashley's wishes, scholar is broadly interpreted to include persons who are not necessarily holding an academic appointment. Now, we rely on our faculty and our college fellows to bring forth nominations each year, and I'm incredibly grateful to Dr. Finus Dunaway, professor in the history department and fellow of Lady Eaton College, for not only taking the time to submit a nomination, but for devoting much time and energy to making this visit engaging for the students and for our Ashley Fellow. Finus is the best person to introduce our Ashley Fellow, Subhankar Banerjee. But before he does that, I want to share a bit about Finus for those who are not familiar with his work. At Trent, Finus teaches courses on topics such as green screen, film and environmental history, American visual culture, and at the graduate level, a course for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies program on environment and place. He is author of 3 books, 2 of which have won multiple awards: Seeing Green, The Use and Abuse of American Environmental Images, and Defending the Arctic Refuge, a photographer, an Indigenous nation, and the fight for environmental justice. So I'd like to invite Finus up to welcome our Ashley Fellow.
Thanks very much, Christine, for the introduction. It's wonderful to see you all tonight. I'm very grateful to the colleges of Trent University, to Lady Eaton College, to the Ashley Fellow Program, and especially to Christine Freeman Roth and Sam Hall for all their work in helping make this happen. I want to thank the faculty and staff who invited Subhankar to come in their classes or organized events or workshops, with a special thanks to Dana Capel for encouraging me to nominate Subhankar to be this year's Ashley Fellow. And I want to thank Subhankar for being willing to come and for, in his characteristic way, embracing the experience with an intense passion that you will rarely see. I can tell you he's loved being at Trent, including taking daily walks on the drumlin and appreciating all that the campus has to offer. I first encountered Subhankar's work during the summer of 2005, almost 2 decades ago, when one of his photographs stopped me in my tracks. It was the colors that drew me in, and I still remember them vividly. There was orange land and luminescent waters alternating until you get to the horizon beyond. And then as I looked more closely, what really stood out were all these tiny little white dots coalescing as waves and undulations, thousands of snow geese flying over the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. It turned out that Banerjee's Arctic photography was being exhibited only a short walk from where I was standing. And so I ended up going to see the show. Not once, not twice, but 3 times over the next week. I later wrote an essay about it and eventually got to meet Subhankar. It was completely fortuitous that I happened to see his photograph that day. But I would say it's even more unlikely is the chain of events that led him to be here as the 45th Ashley Fellow. Subhankar Banerjee was born in India and spent much of his formative years in the city of Kolkata, where he attended university and studied electrical engineering. After that, he moved to the United States and completed graduate degrees in computer science and theoretical physics. He went on to work in the public and private sectors as a computer engineer, and yet today, he's a professor of art and ecology at the University of New Mexico. So I'd like to suggest we have a mystery here. How can we explain this enigma, the strange, unlikely career of Subhankar Banerjee? Now, I could emphasize how he became the subject of intense public controversy when his Arctic photographs were first exhibited at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. during the presidency of George W. Bush. I could list his many awards and accolades, from winning the inaugural Green Leaf Artist Award from the United Nations Environment Program, to being exhibited at the Sydney Biennale and other fancy international art venues, holding visiting appointments at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton or Clare Hall College in Cambridge. I could rave to you about his books, including Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, Seasons of Life and Land, as well as Arctic Voices, Resistance at the Tipping Point. I could tell you about all the projects he's helped to bring to life as the founding director of the Center for the Environmental Arts and Humanities at the University of New Mexico. And I could go on and on about all his current research projects, ranging from biodiversity in New Mexico to the Sundarban Tiger Reserve in India to shorebirds around the world. That would take all night, and you're not here to listen to me, and it would probably embarrass him. So instead, I just want to briefly emphasize 2 qualities that I think best encapsulate Subhankar's work as a photographer, conservationist, and environmental humanities scholar: connectedness and curiosity. What surprised me the most about the Arctic Refuge exhibit when I saw it in 2005 was how Subhankar broke from the conventions of nature photography. Rather than presenting the Arctic as somehow separate and remote, a supposedly untouched, wild place set apart from human society, he portrayed it as a profoundly interconnected ecological space. From bird and caribou migrations to the long history of indigenous presence and continued stewardship of this land, he reframed the Arctic as vitally connected to indigenous rights, environmental justice, and biodiversity. That theme of connectedness runs through all of his work, from his collaboration with Gwich'in elder Sarah James on an art project at the UN Climate Conference COP15 in Copenhagen, to his current work with artists, poets, scientists, and humanities scholars on biodiversity issues in New Mexico. While too often universities encourage the siloing of knowledge, Subhankar has always been an intrepid, visionary bridge builder. It took me a while to understand this, but his focus on connectedness grew out of his relentless curiosity. When he first visited the Arctic in 2001, he did not go with a preconceived agenda, but rather went with an open mind and a willingness to listen and learn from the people he met there. He would tell you, first and foremost, that he became an environmental advocate because of the Gwich'in and Inupiat who shared their knowledge with him. And the entire course of his life was changed by that experience. Today, he continues to follow his passions and curiosities by listening to and learning from diverse groups, whether they be artists or ornithologists, climate scientists or indigenous knowledge holders, archaeologists or wildlife managers, even the occasional historian. I have no doubt that his talk this evening will demonstrate the connectedness and curiosity that define his entire career. And I'm sure that you will find what he has to say to be both enlightening and inspiring. Please join me in welcoming Subhankar Banerjee.
As you can tell that it'll be a very hard act to follow. I hope the talk is even a fraction as good as the warm and spirited introduction. Thank you, Finis, for that warm introduction. And thank you, Christine, for the warm welcome. I respectfully acknowledge that I am speaking to you standing on our traditional homelands, the unceded territory of the indigenous stewards of this place. I'll be a little bit boring and read from notes so that I can stay focused and not ramble, and respect and honor the allotted time. With that, give me a second. Everything is working? Oh, great. Okay. And I think that is there. Good evening, everyone. How many students do we have in the audience? Would you mind raising your hand? Fabulous. Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. As I was preparing this talk, it was a struggle. First part was that it's advertised that I'll be talking about several places, that I give a narrative talk with beautiful stories and show images. But then I thought of you, all the students, that no, I probably need to give a slightly different talk, so critical talk. So maybe a little bit boring, but it may help you to think a little bit more. So we'll see where I go with all of that. I am deeply honored and humbled to have been selected as the Ashley Fellow. I've had a wonderful and very meaningful time since I arrived here 12 days ago. I thank Dr. Christine Freeman Roth, Sam Hall, and all the staff members at the Lady Eaton College. And I thank all the principals of the other colleges who have helped make this event possible. I attended the scarf ceremony the day after I arrived, which was absolutely wonderful. I would be wearing this scarf right now, but it'll probably interfere with the mic, but I proudly wear it. I visited several classes, conducted workshops, and had engaging conversations with students and faculty, many of whom are here. I also regularly walked in the beautiful drumlin and on this beautiful campus. A particular and big thank you to my longtime friend and collaborator, Professor Finis Dunaway, and his wife, Dana Capel, both of whom I have known for a long time, for their incredible generosity throughout my stay, and most importantly, keeping me fed while I'm here. Dana just doesn't let that go. There is always food. The primary focus of my talk will be to highlight why art and visual culture are essential for engaging with and addressing the intensifying biodiversity crisis, which is one of the two most consequential planetary scale crises of human history. And that is not according to me, that is according to the United Nations. Along with the climate crisis, of course, both are human caused and intensifying. The biodiversity crisis has a name, biological annihilation, also given by the scientific community, which includes species extinctions and population declines. But science is not enough. Even can be problematic at times, as we will see. We also need to consider culture, creative expressions of all sorts and cultural practices, along with scholarship in environmental humanities. You will have opportunity to ask me questions after my remarks, but I want to begin with a question for you. So pay attention. Think of this main campus of Trent University. Now tell us, where on this campus do you find a major visual acknowledgement of a particular story in biodiversity crisis, and simultaneously an effective mitigation strategy of that particular problem, all in one visual expression? I will offer a couple of hints. It's an abstract expression, not representational, meaning no plant or animal is depicted. So the horse or the pine cones, as much as you love those, don't qualify. And it's a big part of the visual culture of this campus. meaning it is accessible and visible to us all. I'll repeat the question part one more time. Where on this campus do you find a major visual acknowledgement of a particular story in biodiversity crisis and simultaneously an effective mitigation strategy of that problem, all in visual expression? You have 30 seconds. Raise your hand, get started. Yes, this campus. Oh, the campus itself. That's a little too broad. Let's be specific.
You know the Ashnappi River, the river here, the autonomy is the river of the beating heart, meaning the salmon go across the river like a beating heart. Where does salmon go, right?
That's a very good answer. Anybody else? A crisis, think of a major biodiversity crisis is depicted in this popular visual culture on this campus that is visible to everyone. Hello? No one? Come on. The students? No? Okay. Okay.
I think the student center might be a possibility.
In what way?
I think there's dots on the windows.
Okay, you have seen this. So that's what I'll be doing all evening. I'm not going to entertain you. I will be forcing you to think critically, or encouraging you and urging you. The outside glass walls of the Student Center, walls of the Student Center. In 2014, the Smithsonian in the US estimated that somewhere between 365 and 988 million birds die each year in the US alone by colliding with glass windows in buildings. In Canada, it is a massive source of biodiversity loss. In Canada, that number is far less, don't ask me why, estimated to be between 16 and 42 million. American Bird Conservancy thinks today, 10 years later, those numbers are much higher in the US, well above 1 billion per year. The reasonably close and evenly spaced circles break up the reflection and help avoid bird collisions. Question number 2, where can you find the exact phenomenon in another building on this campus, which is not very effective? In fact, it's not effective at all. Very good. Chemical sciences building where you see, you're paying attention, where you actually see hog decals. We used to think that works, but it doesn't. It's actually the spacing that breaks up the reflection. Okay. With that, think of that as just an icebreaker and getting to know each other a little bit. But I did this intentionally for many of you here as students. So we are going to stay pretty close to here, not go very far. The Flight Light Awareness Program, or FLAP Canada in Toronto, not far from here, has been working on this issue for the past 3 decades. I do not think anyone has written a history of FLAP Canada. You can consider that as a thesis topic or even a book-length study of the wider subject. Since biodiversity is the primary subject of this talk, we will take a few minutes to discuss its etymology or origin. The term biodiversity is widely known and used today. The UN Secretary General frequently invokes it in his various remarks. And yet, unlike the term ecology, which has been around with us since 1866, biodiversity was introduced to the public relatively recently, only 38 years ago. Internal communications reveal that a desire to coalesce the two words, biological and diversity, into a shorter form led to the coining of the term biodiversity. In September 1986, the US National Academy of Sciences and the Smithsonian Institution hosted the first ever National Forum on Biodiversity, which included over 60 speakers. 2 years later, Biodiversity, edited by late Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson, was published by the National Academy's Press. It was the first book with biodiversity in the title and even as the title. The forum concluded with a national teleconference featuring 6 prominent figures in biodiversity science and policy at the time, including E.O. Wilson on the upper left, Thomas Lovejoy, and the others. We are now turning our attention from information to visual culture analysis. Note that all 6 speakers were white. They wore nice clothes. The 5 male speakers wore jacket or suit and tie, including one bow tie. And the only woman panelist, Joan Martin Brown of the United Nations Environment Program, wore a pink suit. Everything matters for us, people like Finis and I who work in environmental visual culture studies, including a bow tie. All from elite and influential institutions, all very good people with a lot of power to shape public policy. Fast forward 34 years, 2020, in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic in mid-August, just as I was starting to teach over Zoom my biodiversity and visual culture class, birds started to fall from the sky all across New Mexico, which was later attributed in part to climate change. Over a 3-month period, 233 different bird species died in the US Southwest, largely in New Mexico, according to iNaturalist. The biodiversity, as you can imagine, crisis was not an abstract concept for the students. It was right in front of them. Some of them went outside and saw dead birds on the ground. A small team of students created a graphic nonfiction which included a digital drawing by Trans-Latinx MFA student Alexandria Zuniga de Dochas, which you see below. A close reading of the text signals a demand for a national biodiversity action plan for the US. As the United States is the only country in the world that is not a party to the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. We were in the midst of not only COVID, but also a very contentious presidential election in the US. The appeal is more broadly to US, not a specific president, not yet. The following year, Joe Biden was inaugurated as the president. Alexandria added color to their illustration and addressed President Biden directly. It was used by defenders of wildlife in a bilingual English-Spanish national student letter campaign to urge the Biden administration to make addressing biodiversity crisis a high priority. Let us zoom into the illustration. Later that year, still a graduate student, Alexandria wrote an op-ed that was published in the Santa Fe New Mexican, a most important newspaper in New Mexico. I will now read the first few lines of the op-ed. Note that they begin by noting their identity, race, class, gender, and profession. These are words from Alexandria Zuniga de Rochas. As a trans Latinx, working class artist and educator, I have seen what the future of environmental conservation looks like in the faces of my community members, friends, colleagues, and students. No longer is it simply a white, straight, and cisgender field. It's intersectional, collaborative, multifaceted, and energetic about instigating real positive change. It's a vibrant group of people filled with a range of perspectives, and we are passionate advocates ready to fight for our future. If you have been following the climate justice movement, you will know that our planet's young people have been at the forefront of actions on mitigating the climate crisis. The same, unfortunately, cannot necessarily be said for the related ever-intensifying biodiversity crisis. But that's beginning to change finally. The two images on this slide, one from 1986 and the other from 2021, that span over 35 years, it would signal that we have made progress as it relates to a term that I'm sure you all are familiar with: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sadly, however, that is not the case, to which we now turn our attention to. Six years after the US National Forum on Biodiversity, in 1992, at the historic UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, popularly known as the Earth Summit, at which the UN established two entities: the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to address the climate crisis, and the Convention on Biological Diversity to address the biodiversity crisis. The diligent work of UNFCCC led to the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate, and the work of CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, led to the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, on the right image, which was adopted in Montreal, Canada on 19th December 2022. As you can tell, I'm plugging in Canada wherever I can, and there'll be more Canada coming. What is not widely known among the public, as it was not reported in the mainstream media in North America and Europe, is that major battles unfolded between two sides over a period of more than 3 years, eventually leading to the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. On one side was the powerful institutional infrastructure of conservation biology and the highly regarded scientists, wealthy and influential conservation NGOs, collectively known as BINGOs, or big international NGOs. That's a term I didn't invent. It's a term in academic scholarship that you will find. Nation states, wealthy corporate backers, and even the United Nations Environment Program, all collectively promoting a model of biodiversity conservation known as fortress conservation, which simply means for biodiversity conservation to work, we have to evict indigenous and other rural peoples from their traditional homelands and ban their traditional harvest and other cultural and spiritual activities from areas deemed worthy of biodiversity conservation. On the other side of the battle included a ragtag team, financially undersourced severely, but it included indigenous communities and other forest-dwelling peoples with little financial resources, and a few human rights-focused conservation NGOs like Survival International. But it also included just one very influential figure, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, who reports directly to the UN Secretary General, does not have to go through any UN agency. In August 2021, the Special Rapporteur released a 36-page brief urging the international community to adopt a rights-based approach to biodiversity conservation and highlighted the violence that are being committed by fortress conservation. During this time, I wrote a number of blog pieces, including this one in Counterpunch. The title says it all, to draw attention to a very important congressional hearing that took place in the US Congress that was completely ignored by the press and media in the US. Silence from the New York Times, crickets from the Washington Post, I wrote in that piece. Extraordinary levels of violence, including murder, rape, and torture, are being committed in Africa and Asia to advance biodiversity conservation, which was exposed during the hearing. Fiore Longo of Survival International, she's from France, called such violence the Abu Ghraib scandal of the conservation industry. That's a very harsh accusation. And in my article, I said that assertion is true. It's heartbreaking. In addition to writing blog articles, I was also interested in exploring how can visual culture help us to understand the limits of science-based biodiversity conservation and its policy recommendations that is causing such violence in the global south. So think of it, I can write articles and history and this and that, but what folks like Finesse Dunaway and I are interested in, our entry point needs to be an image, needs to be visual culture, just like your student center building with all those dots. So the visual culture is our entry point. So I then went into this particular situation with visual culture. The paper, A Global Deal for Nature, Guiding Principles, Milestones, and Targets, published in Science Advances in April 2019, established the scientific framework that eventually led to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The paper includes a map in which almost all of India and more broadly South Asia looks red. One way to interpret this map would be to say that India and South Asia will not have anything to contribute to biodiversity conservation if we adopt the proposed global deal for nature as suggested in the paper by scientists who are largely from North America and Europe, with 2 token scientists from the global south. For me, the map or visual culture was the entry point to realize that if a global deal for nature is implemented as suggested, it will usher extraordinary levels of violence in the global south. In the interest of time, I will have to move on. But if you are curious to know more, I gave an hour-long talk over Zoom due to the pandemic, visualizing global biodiversity toward an understanding of sacred places and relations at Yale University, co-hosted by the Yale Institute of Sacred Music, Yale Environmental Humanities Program, and the South Asian Macmillan Studies Council. That talk was in January 2021, which was posted by Yale on their YouTube channel, which you can access. We turn our attention finally to places as was promoted in the announcement for this talk. River Delta Futures, Endangered Communities in Audiovisual Media will be the inaugural book in the recently launched book series, Global Challenges in the Environmental Humanities from Bloomsbury Academic in London. I'm serving in the International Editorial Advisory Board for the series. The volume is edited by two UK scholars, Francisco J. Hernandez Adrian and Angelos Theocharis, and will be published early next year, I think February. The first chapter is co-authored by Professor Finis Dunaway and I, which focuses on the Arctic in the US-Canada borderlands and the Sundarban mangrove forest in the Bangladesh-India borderlands. I will focus rest of this talk on those two places and will conclude briefly with the Chihuahuan Desert in the US-Mexico borderlands where I now live. The current journey that I have been on for the past quarter century began with a trip to Canada. Canada will come back again and again in Churchill, Manitoba, which proved to be a major turning point in my life and career. After quitting my well-paid corporate job in Seattle, I went to Churchill in October 2000 to see and photograph joyous polar bears, even dancing, just like the ones I had seen in coffee table books. Instead, I photographed this gruesome scene, one bear eating another, atypical. Only later I learned that the image could serve as markers of both the climate and the biodiversity crisis. Briefly, ice in the Hudson Bay. This is probably common knowledge to all of you, but worth repeating. Ice in the Hudson Bay is forming later than usual in the fall and melting sooner than usual in the spring, forcing the bears to spend more time on land where they do not know how to hunt. Forced by starvation, they may resort to cannibalism, as here, still very, very rare though. The following year, in June 2001, I made this photograph in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. Nearly 2 years later, in March 2003, Senator Barbara Boxer used the photo on the US Senate floor and argued against oil drilling, opening up the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, a transnational nursery of global significance to oil and gas exploration and drilling. Her passionate plea resulted in a win, barely 52 to 48 votes for the Indigenous defenders and the environmentalists that day. It also resulted in my soon to open exhibition at the Smithsonian getting censored, which resulted in outcry from the media, a Senate hearing and a Senate investigation, and I was called a liar on the Senate floor by a very influential senator. The photo has been published all over the world. If you follow the social life of a photograph, and I've theorized it later, which I will get to a little bit later, but if you follow the social life of a photograph, you will come across intriguing bits like this one. And you can take a moment to read the title of that article, which was published in The Guardian. The bear in the photo is a part of a population that spans the southern Beaufort Sea of Canada and the US. It lost 40% of its population between the time I made that photograph in 2001 and by the end of that decade. Dr. Charles Monnet and his team first alerted the world about the peril of polar bear due to rapidly melting Arctic sea ice, first published in the journal Polar Biology. That study received global media coverage and inspired animation in the film An Inconvenient Truth. The Obama administration was supportive of opening up the Arctic seas of Alaska to oil and gas drilling. The administration suspended Dr. Monnet, a national scandal. Everyone was interested in publishing the photo as a picture of pure nature, and no one paid attention that it also included culture, remains of a bowhead whale after hunt by the local Inupiat people, which was cropped in this Guardian page. This is visual culture analysis. Last year, Professor Finis Dunaway wrote an article in Washington Post in which he did justice to what's actually in the photo and what came after. In 2015, 12 years after my exhibit was censored at the Smithsonian, I was invited back to speak at the first national conference on the Anthropocene, organized by all 19 museums of the Smithsonian, kind of like the 1986 National Forum on Biodiversity. 2 years later, the book, Living in the Anthropocene, was published, in which I contributed a short essay. Why polar bears? I've been talking with Trent students about that work a little bit, going into more detail. Popular images of polar bears come in one or the other variety: cute, cuddly, and joyous, or apocalyptic, starving and drowning. Almost no one in the mainstream media showed interest in how the people who actually live with polar bears, the Inuit, depict polar bears in their creative expressions, or ask an important question: what is it like to live with polar bears as your neighbors? With that in mind, we turn to Inuit art from Nunavut, Canada. Bear by the Window, a drawing made in 2004 by the late great Inuk artist Ani Potoguk of Kingite, or Cape Dorset as in English, appears deceptively simple at first, almost drawing made by a child. But it is actually an incredibly complex work. One of my favorite drawings from the Arctic of all time. We can take a long time to discuss this work, as I have done with students at Trent University, probably 3 separate classes. But for now, I will just read a few lines from my essay from that Smithsonian book. Bear by the Window, 2004. An unsentimental ink and pencil crayon drawing that challenges popular depictions that romanticize, exotify, or dramatize the animal. She portrays the bear as a scavenger, reaching toward a toppled trash can outside a government-built home. But as it looks up, it sees the partially visible face of a child through a crack in a window curtain. The curiosity of the bear meets the curiosity of the child. The drawing depicts the bear as a part of contemporary Inuit life and resists any attempt to turn the animal into an object of spectacle. Bear by the Window is not for tourist gaze or consumption. We see the rear end, not the face of the bear. It is instead a private moment between a bear and a child, and with a lot of history and contemporary challenges all packed in that image, and offers a glimpse into what it is like to live with polar bears as your neighbor in a rapidly transforming Arctic. We now turn to Sundarban Tiger Reserve, which is part of the largest mangrove forest on Earth, the Sundarban, which is situated in the largest river delta on Earth, the Bengal Delta, that spans coastal Bangladesh and West Bengal, India. I was born and grew up not far from the Sundarban, a couple of hours by road, but it always felt like too far, too dangerous, not easy to visit. Finally, in 2019, I had the opportunity to visit the Sundarban Tiger Reserve, which has become a key site of my current research. Sundarban is the only mangrove forest on Earth that provides home to tiger. During my first visit, I was interested, I don't know why, not in depictions of animals, even though it's one of the global biodiversity hotspot, which I will mention. Not just the tiger, the saltwater crocodile, 450 species of birds, more than 350 species of fish. The list just goes on and on and on. It's a global biodiversity hotspot. I had no interest. I was only interested in photographing 2 things. One was because I was interested in first understanding the visual culture of biodiversity in the Sundarban, which included a yellow nylon fence that covers a significant part of the northern edge of the tiger reserve, bordering the villages, not a subject for photography at all, and interpretive signs inside the tiger reserve, both of which became portal to knowledge. I'll now turn to the yellow fence that serves not so much as a barrier, but as a bridge. I will read a little bit from my chapter in Staying Together, edited by India-based scholar Kaushani Mondol, which was published last year. The key question, what is it like to live with tigers as your neighbor? If you think living with polar bear is hard, think again, especially mangrove tigers. Living with tigers, this is from the chapter, living with tigers in close proximity, as in Shamsher-Nagar, is no easy thing. Fatal incidents can happen, do happen. On April 11, 2004, 20 years ago, a male tiger strayed from the Sundarban Tiger Reserve and entered Shamsher-Nagar. Shamsher-Nagar is on the right, Sundarban Tiger Reserve is on the left. In the evening hours, the tiger killed an 11-year-old girl named Rupali Baulia at her home. It was the only known incidence of human kill by a tiger inside a village in the Indian Sundarban in many years. I read about the incident in a brief article in the Times of India, published a few days after the tragedy. The name of the victim was wrong, as was the account of what happened. I returned to Shamsher-Nagar in November 2022 with the hope that I may have a chance to speak with a family member who still remembers the story from more than 18 years ago. Basanti Baulia, the mother of Rupali Baulia, was working at the vegetable garden in front of the house when we arrived, late morning on November 23rd. She graciously agreed to speak with me. The first thing, this is not a place tourists go, right? The first thing she showed us was Rupali's Samadhi at one edge of the garden, a modest concrete structure painted pink. In Hinduism, a Samadhi is a shrine or memorial built to commemorate the dead. With calm and a soft voice, Basanti Baulia recounted the full story of her daughter's death that day. In the chapter, I have included the full transcription, then translation of that story. Here, I'm just going to read the last few lines. That evening, the villagers built a samadhi for her. The village women were mad, shouting at the Forest Service staff and damaged their boat. But Rupali's father urged them to calm down and told the Forest Service staff that my daughter died. Nobody else should die. Please, you must do something. The construction of the yellow fence was already underway, but Rupali Baulia's death put priority and urgency to the project. Quote, there has not been a single tiger kill inside our village since Rupali died, or inside any other village in our Sundarban, unquote. Basanti Baulia told us, quote, we are very grateful for the fence. The extensive yellow fence, I'm just showing you just a little, I have thousands of pictures just of the yellow fence. The extensive yellow fence across the Sundarban Tiger Reserve that looks like a barrier and makes the Tiger Reserve seem like some kind of a fortress is actually serves as a bridge of trust between the villagers and the Forest Service staff who used to deem each other as adversaries not that long ago. The yellow fence has created its own visual culture and history and sparks conversations on how to live with wild tigers as neighbors. You were looking at the front side of a postcard. I conducted a postcard workshop also at Trent. The postcard was included in a project, a library, a classroom, and the world, which was part of the 2022 Venice Biennale art exhibition Personal Structures, organized by the European Cultural Center in Venice, Italy. I had the honor to serve as the director and co-curator of a library, a classroom at the World, with my partner, Dr. Jennifer Garcia Peacock of Davidson College in North Carolina. The personal structures exhibition included 192 projects from 51 countries and was seen by over 520,000 visitors from around the world. At the conclusion, a library, a classroom, and the world received the ECC Award for University and Research Project. The suite of postcards, 22 total, I co-created with Professor Finis Dunaway and Albuquerque-based, my friend, late graphic designer, David Mendez. As I was installing all this, David died from a heart attack in Albuquerque. He was in his early 40s, very tragic. Starting with the postcard installation in Venice, Finis and I wrote a scholarly essay which was published in the journal Environmental History. You see the term fortress conservation I kind of casually mentioned earlier. If you're curious what that is, you can take a look at this essay that we co-wrote, which was published in the journal Environmental History. We also wrote a brief article for the Network in Canadian History and Environment, introducing the environmental history essay. I'll read a few lines from that piece in niche. We wanted to use, when it comes to postcard and high art, it doesn't get any lower. It's like the postcards would be considered below even catfish in the world of art. Nobody takes postcards seriously. It never gets displayed as objects of art in art museum. Even though contemporary artists do use postcards as source material, it is the lowest form of creative visual expression. We wanted to use this popular visual form to reflect on the global legacies of fortress conservation. While postcards and other popular images may seem like nothing more than pretty pictures of nature, they perform powerful cultural and political work, just as fortress conservation created a sharp divide between wilderness and human society. Visual images, historically and today, traffic in tropes of untouched nature to disavow indigenous presence and to marginalize other ways of protecting nature. In such portrayals, the harsh realities of colonial violence and human rights violations remain hidden from view. In the exhibit's wall text, we emphasized how visual culture weaponizes aesthetics to naturalize fortress conservation. Yet we also believe that critique is not enough. Our postcards highlight surprising contemporary examples of biodiversity protection that depart from the fortress conservation model. We turn now to the Arctic in the US-Canada borderlands. I made this photograph in August 2002 inside the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska, short distance from Arctic Village, an indigenous Gwich'in community of about 150 residents. This is the hunting and fishing camp of Charlie Sweeney, a resident of Arctic Village. The following month, during an activist gathering in Washington, D.C., upon seeing this photo, a young environmentalist asked me with honest bewilderment, quote, "How can there be a hunting camp in a pristine wilderness?" Unquote. That question, more than anything else, led me to take a deep dive into what my friend and historian Carl Jacobi has called, quote, "the hidden history of American conservation," unquote, the subtitle of his book, Crimes Against Nature. For now, let us turn our attention to the caribou and the indigenous Gwich'in people. The Arctic, just to situate you in the map a little bit, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is in the northeastern corner of Alaska. Adjacent to that, on the Canadian side, are two national parks not depicted in this map or not named: Ivavik National Park in the north, and below that, the Vantat National Park. On the Alaska side, below the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, is the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. Together, these areas constitute a vast transnational nursery of global significance. But it is also the homeland of indigenous peoples, including the Gwich'in, who live in 15 communities spanning Northeast Alaska and Northwest Yukon. The most significant part of the map produced by the Gwich'in Steering Committee is the near overlap of the homeland of the Gwich'in and the habitat of the Porcupine River caribou herd, depicted in light and dark beige colors. The Gwich'in people say caribou are not just what we eat, they are who we are, they are in our stories and songs, and the whole way we see the world. Caribou are, without caribou, we would not exist. They regard the caribou calving grounds in the coastal plain of the Arctic refuge as Izigwatsan Gwandai Godlet, or a sacred place where life begins. The campaign to protect that sacred place from oil and gas development has been going on for the past nearly half century. If you are curious to know more about the campaign to defend the Arctic refuge, you will not find a better source than that book on the left that I would highly recommend. Defending the Arctic Refuge, and the companion public history website that Finis built. The book is written with lucid, memorable narrative, just beautiful narrative, and has garnered 3 awards since it was first published in 2021. We turn our attention now to images of migrating caribou. I should show you at least a couple of images. After all, I'm some kind of a photographer, or used to be. I don't know. I made both photographs in early May 2002 in the south side of the Brooks Range Mountains, inside the Arctic Refuge. You see pregnant females of the Porcupine River caribou herd. You just have to believe me that they're all pregnant females. Migrating from their wintering range to the coastal plain, where they will give birth and nurse their young. Their annual migration is the longest migration of all land mammals on Earth. The journey is extremely arduous. The pregnant caribou have to walk over frozen ice on river valleys, pictured on the left, and climb high mountains, pictured on the right. Beyond its aesthetic value, I became interested in the social life of the image on the left, which has been published very widely in books spanning numerous academic disciplines and other print media, including posters and newspaper ads, to which we now turn our attention. I wrote a short chapter in the book, Alaska Native Reader, which included the caribou migration photo. The book was edited by my friend, Tlingit scholar from Alaska, Professor Maria Williams, and was published by Duke University Press in 2009. On the right is the poster the Gwich'in Nation created to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Gwich'in Steering Committee. Having followed the migration of the caribou migration photo, a double entendre, I guess, and the activist work in which I was a part of, I finally theorized 2 concepts: long environmentalism and peripatetic photography. Long environmentalism, after the listening session, is included in the book Eco-Criticism and Indigenous Studies, which was published in 2016. I articulated long environmentalism in this manner. When an environmental engagement has lasted for a while, say a quarter century or more, becoming intergenerational or more, it creates a culture of its own, has its own history. Such a multiple decades-long engagement gives rise to its own distinct form of environmentalism, or what I will call in this chapter long environmentalism. The 2 principal tenets of long environmentalism include collaboration among unlikely allies through the act of sincere listening, giving rise to radical hope. Each of those have actually academic connotations, particularly radical hope, and a period of time that is long enough to enable what was once considered marginal, like a human community or an idea, to become significant and essential. The second concept that I was able to think about, simply following the social life of the caribou migration photo, was this peripatetic photography, which was published in that book, Global Photography, A Critical History. In peripatetic photography, I looked at not how the meaning of a photograph changes as it migrates across spaces, which is what Eduardo Cadava and his colleagues at Princeton University did with the concept of itinerant languages of photography, which they introduced. But rather, I looked at the spaces to which the photograph migrates and encourages us to critically engage with those spaces. So instead of focusing on the meaning of the photograph, I'm more interested in the target space where the photograph lands. This concept has been a foundation for my work as I have become a builder of bridges that Finis was alluding to across academic disciplines and across academia and communities in which we live and work. We now turn our attention to one such space's art exhibitions. This juxtaposition, caribou migration on the left, the print is like 9 feet high, and harvest of caribou by Gwich'in people of Arctic Village on the right was included in my artist in residence exhibition at Dartmouth College in January 2009. In the gallery, at times, I would overhear visitors would say, I love the picture of the migrating caribou, but I wish he had not included the bloody pictures of the butchered animals. What did I hope to accomplish in juxtaposing the two different types of images? It is a strategy, right? I had hoped that the juxtaposition would create at least 3 distinct tensions. First, to take in the large image in its entirety, we have to pull back from the wall. Of course, you have to go in to look at details, but to take it all in, you pull back from the wall. While to see the smaller harvest images, we need to get close to the wall. Second, the opposite happens. The image of the migrating caribou is attractive to most people in the US, pulls them closer to the photo emotionally. While the bloody pictures of butchering can be repulsive, pushing them back from the wall emotionally. Third and finally, it is a tension between aesthetic and justice. The image on the left can advocate for science-based land and wildlife conservation, while the harvest images can advocate for justice or rights-based conservation. At the end of that year, so this is January 2009, we're now going to go December 2009. At the end of that year, December 2009, I went to Copenhagen with my teacher, friend, and Gwich'in elder, Sarah James from Arctic Village. We participated in the Recycles of Paradise exhibition, in which my contribution included images of migrating caribou, both of which you have seen by now, the suite of 4 harvest images, which you don't see in the image here, and a video of Sarah James speaking about the Gwich'in people's relation with and reliance on the caribou for nutritional, cultural, and spiritual sustenance. We were there for the UN Climate Conference COP15. Indigenous peoples were not allowed to enter the Bela Center or take part in the official UN negotiations. We were not part of the official conversations and negotiations, but instead, we were part of the counter conference. You can do the internet search called Climate Forum. We were actually bigger than the official conference, a people's forum on climate justice. There were many people at the opening of the Recycles of Paradise exhibition, including representatives from the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi. Just a few years earlier, as Finis mentioned, I had received an award from UNEP, handed to me in person by Al Gore. The UNEP representatives told me that they loved the migrating caribou images, but they wished I had not brought the bloody butchering pictures of caribou to Copenhagen. The exhibit traveled to Mexico for COP16, eventually ending its journey at the Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions in 2013, by which time a lovely catalog was published. The yellow thing that you see on the left, you will not find the harvest images either in the catalog or in the online archive of the exhibition to the right. That's actually right now. You can go to the website and look at it. A simple cropping has erased those images from the archive. In this case, image eraser and justice are linked. I would be remiss if I don't show you a picture of Sarah James after saying so much. On the left, she's standing next to a coat and the Caribou and Guichin homeland map, which was part of my exhibition at the Harwood Museum of Art in Taos, New Mexico in early March 2020. Sarah and I have done events all over the world. Days before the pandemic gripped us, on the right, she's accepting an honorary doctorate from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, handed to her by her niece, Dr. Charlene Stern, Guichin, Vice Chancellor for Rural, Community, and Native Education at University of Alaska Fairbanks. As faculty, each year, we write letters of support for our students and faculty colleagues. In my academic life, two such letters have become consequential and memorable. Both letters of support for my Indigenous teachers of the Arctic for their honorary doctorate nominations. Rosemary Atuan Garuak Inupiaq, who was awarded honorary doctorate by Oberlin College in 2017, and Sarah James by UAF in 2022. Neither Rosemary nor Sarah has college degree, but they are my teachers. While images like these may at first sight come across gory to some in North America, their purpose is to erase racism and advocate for justice, and include rights-based approaches into global biodiversity conservation. In the picture, you see Joe Tetlichi, whom both Finis and I know well, chair of the Porcupine Caribou Management Board. His son, Jamie, 11 years old at the time, driving the boat, and Jamie's cousin, Shane. They are bringing caribou meat back to Old Crow. What I witnessed during this particular visit on the Porcupine River in the Yukon was intergenerational transfer of knowledge. Thousands of miles away in the Sundarban Tiger Reserve, in the India-Bangladesh mangrove forest borderlands, we see a similar scene of intergenerational transfer of knowledge for the purpose of advocating rights-based biodiversity conservation. I won't go into this. This is also a lot of injustice, and we are bringing attention to justice. That said, let's move on. Finally, we arrive at the title slide. We will linger. Oh, did you ever change the light? Is it better? We will linger here for a little bit. September 30, 2022. Our boat is floating on the Boro Gajikhali River in the Sundarban Tiger Reserve in West Bengal, India. Earlier, we had seen a large male tiger cross a creek in the island, Pir Khali 5. We are waiting with the hope that the tiger may continue to walk close to shore and we may see him again. Just when doubts begin to cloud my mind, maybe the tiger decided to stop and rest. Maybe he took an interior route. The tiger reemerges from behind a kakra tree. The head is visible directly underneath a red garland, looking askance at us. The body partially hidden. I click the shutter. After a brief pause, the tiger walks on. Our guide, Bhabatosh, who is probably 20 years younger to me, but who has become a teacher to me, gives me an enthusiastic hug, as does Buddha, who is very young, who is passionate about photography and is the designated boat assistant. We review the photos on the LCD screen on the back of the camera. The image appears and I hear two words, Dokkin Rai. Bhabatosh explains that the plastic red garland is a trace of an offering to the forest deity Bon Bibi by the honey collectors from a neighboring village after they came out of the forest with a successful harvest in spring. They not only worship Bon Bibi, but also Dokkin Rai, the demon god who appears as tiger. The story of Bon Bibi and Dokkin Rai are well known and written about extensively in Bengali and English. The question that I have been wondering, however, is this: how do I tell the story of Sundarban with visual culture and their interpretations, which will honor the charismatic and the overlooked and their entangled relations that span across places and seasons? In addition to Kakra, we also see at least two more mangrove tree species. On the left is Goran, and behind that is Poshur, which has a few brown fruits. The tree frame an opening with muddy ground and mangrove knee roots, where the paths of the tiger and the honey collectors cross in space, but thankfully not in time. The honey collectors and their family members do not invoke the word bag in Bengali or tiger. They only refer to him as Dokkin Rai. Before entering the forest, they pray to Bon Bibi for protection and to Dokkin Rai that he will stay deep inside the forest, far away from the harvest activities. After a successful harvest, they make an offering on a tree as they exit the forest, of which the red garland is a trace. Now consider the ecotourists, of which I am one, with a camera. We have only one wish: to see a tiger, and if possible, snap a photo. We want the tiger to come out of the forest. As you can see, there is a conflict of wishes playing out here. The harvesters pray that they do not encounter Dokkin Rai while conducting harvest activities inside the forest, while the ecotourist, floating safely on a boat at a safe distance, wishes the tiger would come out of the forest, offering viewing and photo opportunities. This conflict of wishes may seem trivial, but it is one of the most important cultural and economic factors affecting the Sundarban today. The two sides do not consider each other as allies. The villagers who depend on the forest for honey, fish, and crabs speak of the ecological damage that ecotourism is bringing to Sundarban, including pollution, noise, and disturbance to wildlife. The relatively small ecotourism industry, largely owned, managed, and operated also by local villagers, sometimes speak of the harvesters as greedy and wishes that they would just transition to non-forest dwelling, non-forest dependent alternative livelihoods. Both are here to stay though. The red garland is a proof of that coexistence and affirms that the two adversarial models of conservation coexist in the Sundarban, fortress and rights-based, to which we now turn our attention. The photo, Dokkin Rai, embodies the acrimonious debate between fortress and rights-based conservation. In your mind's eye, erase the red garland from the photo just for a moment. Erase the red garland. The tiger is now a tiger, a beloved charismatic species. We may title this updated photo Tiger in a Mangrove Forest, which now can be published in popular magazines like National Geographic and newspapers all over the world, and can be used by advocates of fortress conservation and also to promote tiger tourism in the Sundarban. Now, put the red garland back in the photo. The tiger is no longer a tiger. It is instead Dokkin Rai, a spiritual figure that is simultaneously worshipped and feared. The red garland also signals a claim, not right to ownership of property, but right to belonging in a place, and a right to harvest honey for survival. This photo, Dokhin Rai, can be used by advocates of rice beds conservation. As you can see, the garland changes everything, but there is more. I believe that the red garland is urging us to also consider a new concept in photography. On its own, the red garland is not that significant. Few would consider making a photo if the tiger wasn't in the image. It isn't depicting the ritual that took place in spring. It is merely a humble trace of that ritual. The ritual happened in spring, likely April, while the photo was made in September. The garland shouldn't even be there. Its presence is fortuitous and signals another type of trace, that there was no cyclone in Sundarban Tiger Reserve in 2022, which was a huge relief for the animals, trees, and the local villagers after they endured 3 back-to-back cyclones in 3 consecutive years, Bulbul in 2019, the super cyclone Amphan in 2020, and Yash in 2021. If a cyclone had hit the Sundarban Tiger Reserve between April and September, there would likely not be the red garland on the trees. It would have blown away. A rather small item in the photo, which is not that significant on its own, completely changes the identity and the meaning of the primary subject from a charismatic, beloved species we tourists call tiger to a revered and feared spiritual figure whom the local villagers call Dokhin Rai. Without going into the weeds of photo theory, I humbly suggest that the garland is not a punctum, a powerful concept in photography which was introduced by the 20th century French theorist and philosopher Ronald Barthes. What is it then? I don't know, but I believe the red garland has the promise to open up new conversations in photography as well. I had to return to Albuquerque to resume teaching at the University of New Mexico. The wait time at the Kolkata airport was long. At the international terminal, there is a Vishwa Bangla craft store. I went over there and bought a small jar of Sundarban honey, ₹75, which is less than $1. The tiger, unconcerned about the gaze, is moving from left to right. In addition to tiger and tree, we also see a bee, and a whole new world opens up. The bees migrate to Sundar from eastern Himalaya. According to the large format book, Fauna of Sundarban Biosphere Reserve, published by the Zoological Survey of India. They connect Himalayas to the Sundarban and estimated 2 global biodiversity hotspots. Very different, of course. An estimated more than 40 metric ton of honey is harvested each year from the Indian Sundarban and is processed and marketed through a cooperative system that is supported by the government. Conservation in the Sundarban also includes economic justice for the villagers who are among the poorest residents of West Bengal. The picture of the jar of honey connects Sundarban to the world at large. You are buying it at an international airport, and honors the charismatic and the overlook the tiger, and the bees appear in the same image and urges us to consider rights-based conservation and economic justice along with multi-species kinship. This is visual culture from quotidian life. I close now with a few brief remarks on New Mexico, where I live and work. One of the oldest human habitations in North America, going back to the late Pleistocene, 23,000 years ago, was recently found in what is today the White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico. The story was first revealed in 2021 and made international headlines. There was skepticism in North America, however, as such a discovery would upend a number of academic fields in North America, including but not limited to paleontology and archaeology. Further research put a rest to these doubts for now. The results were published last year in the prestigious journal Science. Just when the White Sands story came to the fore, in 2021, a group of researchers at Yale University published a story that suggests that, quote, the persistence of mammalian megafauna in the Indian subcontinent is related to the great beasts long coexistence there with Homo sapiens and other human ancestors, unquote, coexistence of human and non-human. While the world is largely obsessed with how old the human footprints are in wide sense, some of us are more interested in the long coexistence of megafauna and human that spanned millennia in what is today the White Sands National Park. On the bottom right, you see the print of juxtaposed of a late Pleistocene animal, likely a giant sloth, and on the right, a human, more likely than not a young child or a person. And the last slide, and then I'll close. The insistence and persistence of David Bustos, a dear friend, the resources program manager at the White Sands National Park, eventually led to the discovery by an international team of paleoecologists. Like, the international community ignored David for almost 9 years. And this team, of course, includes David at the helm. In early August last year, I accompanied David and 2 student interns at a new site, the research of which will come out in the coming years. I had breakfast at 4:30 a.m. and the next meal was at 6:30 p.m. We worked all day with just one Gatorade each, nothing else, no shade, and temperature hovered at 42 degrees centigrade or 108 degrees Fahrenheit. At the bottom layer that David is working on was tracks of megafauna and human child. I asked David about the span of time of human-animal coexistence that we are looking at across those steps, going up from him, from bottom layer to the top of the hill. Quote, possibly 30,000 years ago to 4,000 years ago, unquote, David mused. We don't know, only time will tell. Earlier this year, he told me that he had cut a total of 18 steps in that site, and each step had tracks of human and animal, including many tracks of human child. With the story of human megafauna coexistence in the late Pleistocene as a starting point, we are now working on a book, Coexistence Biodiversity in New Mexico, which will be published by the University of New Mexico Press in 2026. With over 500 pages, nearly 30 chapters, oversized, and about 350 full-color images and transdisciplinary perspectives from art and visual culture, environmental and geohumanities, journalism and storytelling, natural and social sciences, and community and regional planning, Coexistence and Biodiversity in New Mexico will be a first-of-its-kind book with the explicit aim to transform biodiversity education in New Mexico and also serve as a model for other states in the US and help shape a more inclusive and justice-attentive biodiversity policy for the US and the world. The book will be accompanied by a statewide exhibition. I'm humbly serving as the editor of the book at the moment and will serve as the curator of the exhibition. Thank you all so much for listening to me. I hope that you will now engage in conversation and ask me questions. Thank you.